and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I was born at Greenwich Palace, sometimes known as the Palace of Placentia, on the 7th of September, 1533. It was the same place that both her father and her half-sister were born in. Born Princess Elizabeth, she was named after both of her grandmothers, Lady Elizabeth Howard and Elizabeth of York, Queen of England. Both of her grandmothers being named Elizabeth made naming her an easy choice. She was the second surviving child of her father, King Henry VIII, but the first of her mother, Anne Boleyn. Her father, the king, had been married once before, and he had a daughter from that marriage, Elizabeth's half-sister, 17-year-old Lady Mary. Princess Elizabeth was born into a complicated England. Her father's first marriage had been annulled only by her father leaving the Catholic Church on behalf of the entire country. Henry had decided that the Pope was an unneeded middleman, with the help of his then mistress, Anne Boleyn. Henry was now supreme head of the Church of England. This had caused a whole lot of drama. Northern England especially wanted to stay Catholic, and their church was being dismantled. King Henry had done this in the hopes of getting a son, but he got Elizabeth instead. Her gender was a disappointment to an entire country. Elizabeth's older half-sister used to be Princess Mary, but when her parents' marriage had been annulled, she had been declared a bastard. She was no longer a princess. She was the 17-year-old Lady Mary, the illegitimate daughter of a king, making the infant Princess Elizabeth the heir presumptive of England. Presumptive, because all it would take would be a single surviving brother, and she would no longer be the heir. She would be the spare. At her birth, she slid straight into the spot that used to be held by her older sister Mary. Both of her parents were sure that their marriage was the will of God, and they were sure that God would reward them with a living boy, something that had been denied him in his first marriage. But then Princess Elizabeth was born, and she was a girl, so all of the celebrations were canceled. They even had some announcements for the birth of the prince printed out, and they quickly had to change it from prince to princess. Princess Elizabeth was baptized at 3 days old. Her mother would have still been in confinement and not in attendance. The royal couple had hoped a boy child would follow. But that's what Henry thought about his first marriage, and that marriage only resulted in Lady Mary. The king's first wife was still living and calling herself the true Queen of England. Their daughter Mary had taken her mother's side in the split. Both of them were on the outs with the king. He was also keeping them apart, divide and conquer. Even when they were ill, and it wasn't sure that they would live, the king would not allow Mary to see her mother Catherine. The new Queen Anne, Princess Elizabeth's mother, had offered her stepdaughter a relationship with her father if only she would recognize Anne as queen instead of her own mother. Lady Mary said her mother was the only queen of England, but if her father's mistress would help, she would be grateful. That was a 16th century clapback. Princess Elizabeth went straight to the royal nursery with a wet nurse. Her mother had to go back to trying to make a boy. Queen Anne was concerned that if something were to happen to the king, Mary would fight for the crown against her half-sister Elizabeth. And the people, especially the people in the north, would probably take Mary's side. Queen Anne decided to put her stepdaughter in her place by making her a lady's maid to her baby sister's household. Lady Mary was treated poorly in that house. Her bedroom was more of a servant's room. Lady Mary attempted to take meals in her room and tried to spend her time alone with God. Queen Anne ordered that she not get food unless she eat with the household. Princess Elizabeth's mother was giving off hard, evil stepmother vibes. She was doing this because it was the only way she knew to protect her daughter. It was a dangerous time. Just after Princess Elizabeth turned 1, her mother was pregnant again. Again, the royal couple was sure it would be a boy. But on Christmas Day, 1534, Queen Anne miscarried the baby she was carrying. England, at this time, was a very superstitious place. Miscarrying the future king of England on Christmas Day was a bad omen. Maybe God didn't approve of this marriage either. This is what happened with the king's first marriage. one girl, and a lot of late-term pregnancies not being successful. To our modern ears, we may hear that possibly King Henry had something medically wrong. His children weren't surviving until birth because of some genetic problem, because both of his first two wives had the same problem. But in the 16th century, nothing was the king's fault. Not this, not anything. He had been tricked by lying women into marrying them, and this would have been on King Henry's mind. This was strike one against Queen Anne, and by proximity, Princess Elizabeth, because she had the misfortune of being a girl. She had let down both of her parents. Queen Anne would have been horrified, not only because she lost a baby she had so desperately wanted, but also because she too knew that this was strike one. The king was angry with her for losing this child, and the entire country blamed Queen Anne. The country already kind of hated her because she had displaced their beloved Queen Catherine, whose only flaw was not being able to produce a surviving son. Princess Elizabeth was a baby, only a year old, and had no idea that she could be in danger. The following year, Queen Anne was pregnant for a third time. She miscarried that baby as well. This baby had the appearance of a boy. This was strike two. Queen Anne didn't have many chances left. She had been pregnant 3 times and had only one surviving girl to show for it. Baby Elizabeth was still too young to be aware of the turmoil in her parents' marriage. She didn't even live with her parents. She had her own household run by her governess. But most of England was aware. King Henry had been asking around about how to get rid of his second wife without looking like a guy who abandoned his wives. His people were like, no, you can't have 2 living discarded wives and 2 living discarded daughters. That's not a great look. So, begrudgingly, Henry went back to his relationship with his second wife, Queen Anne. By October, Queen Anne was pregnant for a 4th time. This was her last chance. She had to give birth to a baby boy this time if she wanted to stay in the king's favor. She had been pregnant every year since Elizabeth's birth, and 2-year-old Elizabeth still didn't have a younger sibling. During this time, the king was not happy in his second marriage. He was spending time with his mistresses, specifically one of Anne's ladies, one Miss Jane Seymour. Queen Anne was simply trying to stay calm and stay pregnant. Princess Elizabeth was a 2-year-old princess with a household that included her stepsister, 19-year-old Lady Mary. I think this time was important for both Mary and Elizabeth. There was sibling rivalry, for sure, and it was complicated. But I think during this time, they bonded a little bit. There was still resentment, and the sisters were never super close. But with all the drama that happened to these 2 sisters, they never really turned on each other. Elizabeth was a cute red-headed toddler, and Mary was a neglected teenager. But they were also sisters living together in the same household. In January of 1536, news arrived that King Henry's first wife and Lady Mary's mother, Catherine, had died at the age of 50. Lady Mary was devastated. Her mother was her biggest supporter, and a big part of why the people loved her so much. She was denied permission from her father, the king, to attend her own mother's funeral. Henry was delighted that his ex-wife had died. She was making him look bad just by living and playing the victim, in his opinion. He was having the best time. His second wife was pregnant with what had to be a boy, and he was playing with his mistress, 26-year-old Jane Seymour. Anne knew about Jane Seymour and tried to be cool about it, but she was not cool about it. I covered all that drama in both Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour's episodes. Check them out if you haven't. Not long after that, King Henry was in a jousting accident. He was unconscious for literal hours. I think it's pretty clear that King Henry woke up a very different man than he had left as. He had what I see as a pretty obvious now traumatic brain injury. During the time he was unconscious, people doubted that he would survive. The longer he was out, the more sure people were that he was going to die. The people who should have been the most scared would be Queen Anne, and if she had been a little older, Princess Elizabeth. If Henry died, there would be a civil war, with people supporting Princess Elizabeth and Protestantism on one side, and people supporting Lady Mary and Catholicism on the other side. Without the king, Lady Mary likely had the most support, and she probably wouldn't be kind to her evil stepmother, and maybe not to her baby half sister that had replaced her. But they didn't have a good relationship. He didn't even really acknowledge her existence. If he died, she would have been scared, but she probably thought she could get popular support and go from servant to queen. Kind of a literal Cinderella story. On top of that, 2-year-old Elizabeth and 19-year-old Mary both had supporters who would have been sending armed guards to both girls in case war was about to break out. And some probably more shady supporters who were likely sending assassination squads to both girls, because without one of them, the other one would just win. This was a full red alert, and everyone just waited. But then the king became conscious again. Everything was called off. Everyone pretended that they had known all along that the king was just fine. God wouldn't let him be taken out by some dumb accident. Whether brought on by the stress in her 3-person marriage, or the stress from her husband's near-death experience, or maybe caused by what caused the last two, Queen Anne suffered her 3rd miscarriage in the 2.5 years since she had her first baby. This was strike 3, and everyone knew it. Henry was done. His first wife was dead. His second wife was not doing her job. He told his advisors to figure it out, find a reason for him to get rid of Anne so he could start over again with a clean slate. Anne knew she was out of favor, possibly forever. She begged Henry's forgiveness while holding her 2.5-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth. Henry wouldn't even speak to her. Elizabeth may not have been old enough to remember this, but she was 2.5. She would have known something was very wrong. Her mother was upset, her father was angry, and they were all together, but not in a fun way. That didn't happen very often. I have memories from that age. My first memory was from when I was about 2.5. This also was probably the last time she saw her mother alive. King Henry's advisors had been working on finding legal fault with Anne. They called all of her ladies in and asked them so many questions while scaring them. They were looking for anything they could pin on the queen. They finally landed on a crime. Queen Anne had always been a little flirtatious, a lot flirtatious. They decided she was too flirtatious to be a faithful wife. She must have cheated on the king. And while the king was allowed to have a mistress, the queen sleeping with someone else would be considered treason. That was not allowed. For round 2, they called in all the men they thought she may have slept with, including her own brother George. They could only torture one of these men because most of them were noble and you can't torture nobles. That man confessed to everything and totally named names. But he probably just wanted the torture to stop, so can we really rely on that? The other men denied every single bit of it. I go into that in Anne Boleyn's episode, but long story short, Anne and a handful of men were accused of treason and executed. Princess Elizabeth was only 2 years and 8 months old when her mother was executed by her father. To make matters worse, the toddler also had fallen out of favor with her father. Because Queen Anne was accused of adultery, he couldn't be sure that Princess Elizabeth was even his daughter. So like her sister, she was now an illegitimate daughter of the king. Lady Elizabeth was now just like her sister Lady Mary. And their father was on to his 3rd wife, Lady Jane Seymour. Lady Mary, at 19, was old enough to see her sister was in the same disfavored position as she was. If they weren't at least a little bonded by then, they were now. The new Queen Jane was pregnant within her first year of marriage. A month after Lady Elizabeth turned 4, her stepmother, Queen Jane, gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The kingdom was thrilled. If this baby survived, he would be the first English royal boy to survive since the birth of his own father. Queen Jane had been a different kind of stepmother than Elizabeth's mother had been. Queen Jane supported her husband having a relationship with his daughters. They were still not in the line of succession, but they did have a small relationship with their father. Both were in attendance at their little brother's christening. 4-year-old Elizabeth carried the christening cloth. But joyous celebration gave way to mourning. 12 days after the birth of her son, Queen Jane died from complications from childbirth. Kat Ashley was appointed Lady Elizabeth's governess. She is the one who raised the young Elizabeth. Sources state that she accustomed the little girl to the elaborate code of politeness and respect to her elders. In addition, she taught her charge pursuits such as needlework, embroidery, dancing, and riding. By the age of 6, Elizabeth was able to sew a beautiful shirt as a gift for her younger half-brother. Evidently, Kat had been well educated, for she effectively taught the precocious princess mathematics, geography, astronomy, history, French, Italian, Flemish, Greek, and Spanish. Elizabeth herself praised Kat's early devotion to her studies by stating that Kat took great labor and pain in bringing me up in learning and honesty. Elizabeth could write in English, Latin, and Italian. Her father wasn't a huge part of her life. After the death of Queen Jane, he had fallen into a depression. He gained a lot of weight and developed diabetes. He married Anne of Cleves and almost immediately discarded her. Then he married the young Catherine Howard. Catherine was 7 years younger than Henry's daughter, Lady Mary. That also didn't last long. Both of these women also have an episode where I get into all that drama. Then King Henry married for the 6th and final time in 1543 to the 30-year-old Catherine Parr. Henry, by this point, was 52. His daughter Mary was 27 and still unmarried, and his daughter Elizabeth was 10, and his son Edward was 6. Catherine Parr was, like Queen Jane, in favor of Henry reconciling fully with his daughters, including adding them back into the line of succession after their brother. Queen Catherine was a Renaissance feminist. She supported female education and her stepdaughters. She seemed to be quite an influence with Lady Elizabeth. And her husband did come around, restoring both of his daughters into the line of succession. And just in time, because Henry died just 4 years into this marriage, leaving his 9-year-old son, Prince Edward, the new King of England. The king is dead. Long live the king. Prince Edward was now King Edward VI. Elizabeth and her governess, Kat Ashley, moved into the household of Elizabeth's stepmother, Dowager Queen Catherine. At 14, she was considered a young adult, so her governess was by this point more of a lady-in-waiting. Back to Elizabeth. She was living with her stepmother, and her stepmother was getting married. Her stepmother was marrying the uncle of Elizabeth's little brother, King Edward, because everyone's related. This man was Thomas Seymour, the brother of the former Queen Jane. From 14 to 17, she lived with Catherine, Thomas, and Thomas's ward, Lady Jane Grey, who was just a few years younger than Elizabeth and her cousin. Elizabeth's treatment during these years is suspect. Her, adoptive stepfather, Thomas, was behaving inappropriately. At first, no one thought it was all that strange, but it started to get noticeably weird when Thomas entered Elizabeth's bedroom wearing only his nightshirt and tickled Elizabeth while she was still in bed. Kat Ashley mentioned it to Catherine, but Catherine blew it off at first as normal fatherly affection. But then he smacked her on the butt a few times, and they were caught hugging a couple of times. Elizabeth was just a teenager of 17, but that was an adult then. She was slapped and sent away. Catherine also left her husband Thomas, even though she was now pregnant with his baby. Catherine then died from complications from childbirth. So back to Princess Elizabeth and Kat Ashley. Kat was all, hey, now that your stepmom is gone, you could go comfort her husband. Ew. It didn't last long, though, because Thomas got into trouble trying to kidnap his nephew, the king, and he was executed. Elizabeth was getting used to losing people. Her mother, her father, her stepmother, her stepfather. In 1553, she also lost her brother, King Edward VI, when he was only 15. He had been Henry VIII's only legitimate son, and succession was up in the air. The king is dead. Long live the queen, because all of the options for the next ruler were female. What was England to do? King Henry had said that Princess Mary would be next and Princess Elizabeth after that. But King Edward was a Protestant, and he didn't want to give the throne to his Catholic half-sister Mary. So right before he died, he changed the succession again, because, like father, like son, his sisters were again removed from the line of succession, naming their cousin, Lady Jane Grey, the next queen. The same Lady Jane that had lived with Elizabeth in her teen years as Thomas's ward. And then there was always the option of their other cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. But Mary, Queen of Scots, was a 10-year-old Queen of Scotland who lived in France and was Catholic, so she was kind of out of the running this time. Lady Jane was named Queen by the Privy Council, and Princess Mary raised an army. She was not going to allow her Protestant cousin to take her throne. Elizabeth had to take sides, and she decided to support her older sister Mary, despite the fact that Mary was Catholic and Elizabeth was Protestant. She felt her sister's claim was stronger, and she must have felt like she would be safer if she stood by her sister. Lady Jane Grey is known as the 9 Days Queen because Mary was correct. She had all of the support. Well, most of the support. Nearly 1,000 Protestants fled Mary's reign. The Queen is in prison. Long live the Queen. Queen Mary entered London with her sister, Princess Elizabeth, at her side. Lady Jane was executed. I talk about that in her episode. The sisters were solid, but that didn't last long. Mary was very Catholic and sought to right the wrongs of the last 2 decades as she saw it. For Elizabeth, this was the first time she had lived as a Protestant in a now Catholic England. This only got stronger when Queen Mary married a known Catholic, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Philip. Queen Mary ordered that everyone attend Mass, including her non-Catholic sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth conformed publicly, but inside she remained Protestant. When Elizabeth was 21, a rebellion broke out to overthrow Queen Mary and replace her with her sister Elizabeth. Elizabeth probably wasn't in on this rebellion. She had just been laying low and trying to survive. Her sister, Queen Mary, had her suspicions, though. Princess Elizabeth managed to convince her sister that she was a full, loyal supporter of her sister's reign, but not before she was arrested and interrogated and held in the Tower of London. Mary's advisors were advising that Mary wasn't safe while Elizabeth lived. This would have been the same fear as when her father had had his accident, the difference being that now she was an adult and she understood the danger she was in. Elizabeth's supporters managed to, along with Elizabeth, convince Mary not to execute her. Instead, she was sent into house arrest. On her way, escorted to her house arrest, crowds cheered for her along the route. The following year, Elizabeth was called to court to attend her sister. Queen Mary was pregnant. If Mary and her child died, as sometimes happened, Elizabeth would probably be the next queen. But as it turned out, Mary was not pregnant. It was a phantom pregnancy. Mary had never been pregnant. Mary was by now nearly 40, and it was unlikely she would be able to become pregnant. Elizabeth was almost for sure going to be the next Queen of England. Her brother-in-law, Philip, became the King of Spain when his father died. He decided to ally with his sister-in-law, Elizabeth, not because he thought she'd be a great ally, but because Mary, Queen of Scots, was already betrothed to the next King of France, and they would be a powerful duo. If Queen Mary died, he would need the next ruler of England to be on his side to be able to stand against the now joined Scotland and France. Queen Mary finally officially named her half-sister her heir on the 6th of November, 1558, when it was clear that she was dying. Queen Mary died just 11 days later. The Queen is dead. Long live the Queen. Princess Elizabeth was now Queen Elizabeth I at the age of 25. She had lost her entire family now. Her parents, her step-parents, all of her siblings, both legitimate and illegitimate. She was alone. And she was only the second Queen Regnant of England. Female rulers in England were a complete new thing. But the nobles went to Elizabeth and pledged their allegiance. Elizabeth was crowned queen 2 months later on the 15th of January, 1559, a date she chose with the help of an astrologer. The country supported Elizabeth, but it was still unstable. After the reign of Bloody Mary, the Protestants were happier, but still afraid of the Catholics. Elizabeth was a Protestant who also kept Catholic symbols like a crucifix. She was a Protestant, but not as much of a Protestant as her sister was a Catholic. She was breezy about religion. There was something else to worry about. Who was she going to marry? And she had to marry because she was without an heir. And there was no one to rule after her. She was the last one. An added bump was that King Henry and King Edward had been supreme head of the Church of England. But Elizabeth was in charge now, and while the people would allow a woman to be queen, they weren't sure if they trusted her to be head of their religion. Silly, because she was perfect for the job. She had been raised from birth in that religion and had also been exposed to quite a few Catholics. She was tolerant and knowledgeable, and they passed a law that whoever was in charge of England was the head of the Church of England. That law stands today. The current head of the Church of England is King Charles III. The next one will probably be Prince William, or as we will call him then, King William V, and then his son, the future King George VII. Back to Queen Elizabeth I. She was 25 and in love. She was in love with her childhood friend, Robert Dudley. The problem being that Robert Dudley was already married to his wife Amy. For the next year and a half, Elizabeth was in love with Dudley, and Dudley, whose wife was said to be sick, was entertaining making Queen Elizabeth his second wife. They just had to wait until Amy died. Queen Elizabeth's advisors were telling her that this was a bad idea and pushing her to other political marriages. She seemed to have interest in no one except Dudley. The following year, Amy did die, but she didn't die from the illness that she reportedly had. She died from falling down a flight of stairs. The coroner declared it a fatal accident, but people were sus. Did Dudley kill his wife so he could marry the queen? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe she fell. Maybe she was pushed. But Elizabeth couldn't risk people turning on her. Anyway, death in an accident meant that she could not marry Dudley without risking her crown and her life. And Elizabeth had learned to be very, very careful. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share with friends. If you hated it, share it with your enemies. I'm not picky. Long live to all the queens out there, and until next week, bye.
Thanks for listening.